Bam.
I am Paul Gregory, and this is the Break-In Show. Break It Down Show. Excuse me.
Break It Down show. That's
Got it
right.
right. Got it right.
You did. You did. And if you guys haven't heard about Paul's book, it's incredible. Paul knew the Oswalds. That's just the straight way to say it. He wrote a book called The Oswalds. And when I say he knew them, he knew Lee Harvey and his wife in a way that really nobody else in the nation knew it. His dad, himself, he knew them as friends, and waited a long time, 60 years, to write a book and did extensive research. Paul, in his own right, is an academic who knows how to do research. So I guess the question, and I know you had to answer this a number of times, but why did you wait? Why did you wait 60 years to write this book?
We could take about 30 minutes on that question. I would say there's more than one reason for waiting. There was a family reason, and that family reason was that we were not particularly proud once the assassination took place of having known and offered hospitality to the man who shot the president. And this was a man with a very questionable background, a communist, Marine deserter. I don't know if he actually would be characterized as a deserter, defecting to the Soviet Union. So clearly, we lived in a community that would not be very impressed or would be quite upset if they learned that the Gregory family had associated with this Oswald guy. So that's really the overriding reason. And I clearly couldn't write that book while my parents were alive. So that was one factor. The other factor is that I am a fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford, which has some eminent historians who were on my back once they heard of this aspect of my life. They were on my back. They say, you experienced history. And to tell the truth, I had not understood that until they got on my back. And so their argument was you would really be, let's say, stupid is too strong a word, but you really need to write this down. So that was another factor. There may have been other reasons. Those two come to mind right now. The third reason was that I indeed sort of changed in the course of my career from economist to historian. And I knew, because I'd worked a lot and with Russian archives and Soviet archives, many of them secret, that were purchased by the Hoover Institution archives. And so I'd worked for 20 years in these formerly secret archives. So I consider myself a pretty good researcher. And if you look at the book does contain a lot of very original research. Reading the Warren Report, reading Lee Harvey Oswald's KGB file, et cetera, et cetera. So I was trying for a good mix of historical material that I had dug up, personal knowledge, sort of anecdotes from being together with Lee and Marina. So those three things convinced me that I had a good book. So I sat down and wrote it. Took a long time to write, by the way.
I can imagine, because there's there's got to be a lot of Laura Ingalls Wilder experience too. Is like, as you put yourself into that environment, that kid who's going to go off to college, the kid who's sitting across from Marina working on language. I mean, all of it, you're like, oh my gosh, that's right. I wore that white shirt that day. And I know that because she offered me jam or whatever. And I'm just making things up. But these memories unlock. And that's just one aspect of why this is hard to write. Plus, there's all these different things. One of the things that was fascinating to me about the book was you got to read the real-time interviews of you as a young man who, I would assume you're being as genuine and as helpful as you can be as this tragedy is unfolding, and you and your family are squarely in the middle of it, and you have a suspect eye on you at some point, and you're just like, how do I navigate this? And you're so young. So when you're reading your own words from the FBI, whether you knew that you were being recorded specifically about certain things or not, what were your thoughts when you read, young Paul's words and reactions being interpreted by a G-man?
Uh, well, it was quite interesting to read my own words. One reason for being interested in reading my own words was the fact that I wanted to know if my memory was good. And the remarkable thing about reading my own words, reading my father's testimony, and so on, was the remarkable thing was that my memory was quite good. And in general, my memory is not very good. But I think if you think a long time about something, things return to consciousness that you had long forgotten. So I was quite impressed by the fact that virtually all of my memories turned out to be accurate, because if you get into the raw material, the data, I was able to find a number of instances where others were present, where others were remembering a particular event. And invariably, my memory was correct. And in some cases, the difference between what I remember and am confident of and what others saw at the same time and place sometimes can be important. I don't know if you recall, you're too young. There's a famous Japanese film called Rashomon, and it was about a rape and murder. It's a Japanese movie from the perspective, I think from 4 different perspectives, and each perspective was quite different.
Right.
And I sort of experienced that, and an example of this was the dinner party at our house where I introduced Lee and Marina to what we call the Dallas Russians, the Dallas Russian community, headed by one George Bucha. So if you read the others' testimony of that dinner party, the most important things they left out. Either they didn't want to talk about it, or they didn't see it. It was that the dinner party ended with one of the guests, Anna Meller, sort of attacking Lee. Tell us why you did such stupid things in your life. Why did you leave the Marines? Why did you go to the Soviet Union? I myself escaped from the Soviet Union, and it was a terrible place. And Lee became very defensive, and he became quite agitated. One of the few times I've seen Lee being agitated, because he was being attacked in Russian in front of Marina. So for him, this was a catastrophe. If you read their testimony, George Bucha and Anna Meller's testimony, they didn't even mention this, and this was the whole point of what came out of this dinner party. So I'm sort of off track here, so you might get me on track again, but I think I've answered.
Well, yeah, I'll get you on track. So there are so many things, and you make the reference to the movie in the book, and I'm glad you brought that up. There are all these instances where you are in a moment that actually happens, and whether we know about it in the big historical sense or not, you have the context in between some of these moments. You're looking at the historical references, as you say, academic grade historian, surrounded by people like Victor Davis Hanson, who are worldwide known historians, right? So your work is on par with some of the best historians we have. When you read through this and then you see people make leaps, because sometimes historians have to, and you go, oh gosh, that's too big of a leap for Lee, because you know who Lee was, you know how much he abused his wife. And I want to layer in one piece of context with this too. If you if this happened today, Marina wouldn't have two rotten teeth. They'd get those things fixed pretty much right away. She would have access to more of the Russian community, even the Belarusian community. She wouldn't, it would, there'd be more openness. He wouldn't be as self-conscious about his learning disability. He would probably learn how to overcome it. Like, this is a very specific point in time where all of these things can turn into this stew. So when you see people analyzing and concocting who Lee was, do you see the errors in their judgment based upon the people, the families that you knew, the interactions? Because you're watching him, like, his brain possibly break at that, at that dinner, when it was like, oh man, he's now going to compartmentalize these people away out of his life and go in a different direction.
Well, it's a complicated question, and I have sort of two ways in which I can address it. Let me try the first, and then I'll
Please.
try to remember the second. The first is, if you're basically asking if Lee and Marina were if Lee were alive today, married to Marina, what would they be like? My answer is they would be sitting in Minsk, Russia. Lee would be on a pension, which would give them a reasonable lifestyle. And he would be agitated because he's not achieved all the things that he wanted to achieve, because he considered himself destined for greatness. So the biggest mistake of Lee's life was leaving Minsk, because he's not going to have a better life than the life that he had in Minsk. With respect to the second direction I could perhaps go, is the following, and that is, did people tend to size Lee up incorrectly? And I think that's one of the major contributions of this book, because in order to accept the fact that he was a lone assassin, that is, he shot the president and he did it alone, you cannot have someone with total disabilities or total inability to accomplish things. In this regard, Lee was a remarkably adept person. If you look at all that he managed to accomplish, going to Russia as an 18 or 19-year-old, preventing the Politburo, which took up his case, which was a remarkable finding. He defied the Politburo. He pretended to commit suicide. He was able to convince the Russian authorities for him to stay in Russia, despite having thrown his passport on the desk of the consular official at the American embassy. He was able to convince them to let him go home. They even gave him the money to go home. He would badger his brother and his mother to do certain things for him. He was extremely good at manipulation. He was persistent. He didn't give up. And so this is someone, particularly if they feel they're destined for greatness, who has the ability to get things done and without any particular help. So I think the fact that he had this learning disability, the fact that he couldn't spell, the fact that he didn't know the difference between T-O and T-O-O, all of these things, which convinced me that he was not terribly adept at doing anything, masked the fact that he was really an ideal person to kill a president or a general or a mayor, or if he were alive today, I would say he would be a school shooter, probably as high as he could aim. So his learning disabilities masked the features that were perfect for killing a president. I think I sort of touched on your question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I've been to Dealey Plaza. I've stood in the school book depository. You can't stand, at least when I was there, you couldn't stand in his nest, but you stand one window over, and it's just not a hard shot. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
that's
an
what I
Army
wanted
guy.
to ask you with your military background, because I in fact asked this question of Jim Mattis, who's a fellow at Hoover Institution. He said any Marine could have made that shot, and
Yeah,
apparently he did have a marksmanship
yeah.
record of some kind.
And you absolutely, if you're dealing with the moving target, you're excited. You absolutely could overshoot that first shot. That target is so close. And you're shooting through a scope or an iron sight. You might overshoot it. Take a deep breath. Bam, right through the middle. It's
Well,
just too close. You know.
there is some discussion of why, and I've tried to avoid getting into the forensics of the
Right.
assassination. I just want to talk about things that I'm capable of talking about. But I am intrigued by the fact that he may have delayed the first shot, and my interpretation would be he thought it over. Look, I'm about to kill a president. Should I really do this?
Yeah.
And he did it. So my interpretation of any pause is, you know, am I really going to do this? Am I really going
Yeah.
to pull this off? I don't know if you have a feeling about this.
Yeah. He's staring at the Rubicon and he's got those rocks in his hand. And is he going to throw them? Yeah. He's deciding that, right? Like that is a point of no return.
Mhm.
He knows he got lucky with the general. We can talk about the general in a moment, but yeah, there's a moment there, and then he acts, and so sure, maybe a better shot is coming down the street towards him, but maybe not. Maybe there's some circumstance. Maybe he doesn't want to hurt anybody else, and he's like, no, this is my shot right here, and he's already decided. And tactically, it's so close, doesn't matter. And so when it gets there, the time gets real, and
Mhm.
he's got plenty of time. I mean, that shot is 70 yards, maybe, and yeah, he's got time. He's got time to think. And that, in that case, and look, I can't speak for him, but your brain is moving in a way. I've been in combat, I've been shot at, all that kind of thing, right? And time moves differently. It flows. It can snap, and 8 hours can seem like 20 seconds, and 20 seconds can seem like 8 hours, right? And so it's an interesting thing to think about when you talk about time and how much time he had. He might have had all day, depending on how he was experiencing it, and we'll never know the answer to that question. But from what I know from being in those situations, it can be all the time. He might have had all the time in the world sitting there.
Mhm. Well, fortunately,
So
I've not been in
yeah,
combat, fortunately, so
yeah.
I'll listen to your opinion.
So let's dive back in. When you look at this, obviously when you're doing this, you don't think you're part of this historic event that's playing out over, a year, right? You're just interacting with people that you're getting to know. And then you look back and all of a sudden it has all this new context. How did you how did you deal with that? I mean, you said like there was some family shame, but how did you personally deal with the whole thing of, like, because there's grief, right? And there's a long-term grief because this is a historic event. It damages the nation. Some people would say we never recovered from it. So how do you deal with it?
Well, I would say I was in shock for more than a year. I didn't particularly want to talk about it. I limited the number of people I told just to very close friends. Um, so the best word I can come up with is shock. It it wasn't shame. That was more a family thing. Um, I I had strange dreams in which brought Oswald and Kennedy together with me, and then I would before waking up, I'd say, well, I knew both the assassin and the person assassinated, so I had strange dreams. Um, I met my wife a year later in Germany.
Right.
That was in October of '64, and believe it or not, I did not tell her about this until she came to the U.S. before we were married. So that
Yeah.
was, and after the assassination, I did have a fellowship to study for a year in Berlin. And Berlin, as you know, was had great adulation of Kennedy.
Yeah.
But I made sure I avoided any news people or anything like that who would have made this a big national story. So I just sort of wanted it behind me, I would say. On the other hand, I did realize probably from the first 5 minutes of all this that I was a witness to history. But the best word is shock, and that shock took a couple of years to resolve itself.
We had there's a guy who's a historian. He calls himself the First Ladies man. He studies all the First Ladies, and his name's Andrew Oak. And he was talking about how over, I think it was at the Johnson Ranch, they were preparing for a meal to receive the Kennedys there. And you imagine the shock. They're all, here comes, the Kennedys. We're going to have this barbecue and reception. There's always people are going to be here. And then, just that kind of shock. Everybody was just floored. Were you at all concerned about being wrapped up into some kind of prosecution or, because it's easy to become part of a conspiracy. You're like,
I left that out of the fourth reason for writing the book and delaying writing the book. And that is, somehow, I think my father understood it from the first moment, that we would be prime suspects
right.
for a conspiracy theory movement. The reason for this is my father was an oil man. He belonged to Rivercrest Country Club. We belonged to Rivercrest Country Club, which is where the oil barons and moguls hung out. He played golf with them. And so it was clear, if you're looking around for explanations, you turn to LBJ, or I don't really know the argument behind turning to oil interests, because whether JFK had a particular oil policy that they liked or disliked, I don't know. But it was clear that we would be subjects of a conspiracy.
Right.
And contrary to the expectation, the conspiracy involving us really originated in Moscow, because the Politburo, once they got word from, I think the ambassador may have been Dobrinin in Washington, but they got word immediately that Kennedy had been shot, and he'd been shot by a communist. So they couldn't tolerate that, the Politburo. So they had to dream something up. And what they dreamed up, or what they decided they must do, would be to turn Oswald from a left-wing communist into a right-wing fanatic. And so who's going to turn him into a right-wing fanatic? Well, who's the guy translating for Marina? Pete Gregory,
Right.
a Russian guy. So this Pete Gregory must have pulled off some kind of trick to convince the world that Oswald was a communist, when in reality he was a right-winger.
Yeah.
And there was great controversy over my father's translations for Marina. And interestingly, after the book was written, some anonymous person sent me a tape of my father translating for Marina. And in that tape, the controversy was her description of the assassination weapon, which the Soviet conspiracy theory said, oh, it can't be Oswald, because for some reason they accused my father of mistranslating Marina's description of the assassination weapon. And I did listen to it, and I didn't hear anything to that effect. There was some new information in that tape, And it was that on the evening after the assassination, when my father was translating for her at the Six Flags Inn in the presence of the Secret Service, she was convinced at that point that Lee would not have tried to kill Kennedy. He must have been shooting at someone else.
Mm.
But by the next day, I think the evidence had accumulated, and she moved away from that explanation. But I found that surprising that she was quite convinced that Oswald must have been shooting at someone else. And one reason I think she was convinced is she had such admiration for Kennedy and for Jackie and the kids that Lee had never objected to, because they discussed this in my presence.
Yeah.
And she expressed admiration for the Kennedys, and Lee said, "Oh yeah," was sort of nodding. So I did find that interesting, and I also find it interesting that didn't make it into the Warren report. But there are many things that slightly off, I would say.
You mentioned in the book that they had saved someone, and Marina, Lee. Either way, there is a copy. I think it was of Life with the Kennedys on the cover from a couple of years previous that
Time,
they had brought. Time, yeah, that
Mhm.
they had saved and was prominent, on the coffee table, if I remember in the book correctly.
Correct.
And so, I mean, this is the impact that family has. Like, they're showing off that they're like, yeah, we think the Kennedys are it. Like we're people of our time.
And yeah, this would have. I did a little bit of research on that, and that issue came out while Lee was in Minsk.
Mm,
But I did learn, I guess, through Robert Oswald's testimony, that Lee had asked him to send certain subscriptions to Minsk, among them being Time magazine. That's interesting because he must have brought, I mean, just think of a family packing to leave the Soviet Union for the U.S. They would be very careful about what they brought. They would only bring their most prized possessions with them.
yeah.
Given the dating of that, it means Lee brought that with him. So there was some, either Marina or there was some fascination with the Kennedys, as evidenced by that Time magazine, which never moved while the whole time I was in and out of their house.
Can you, in your mind's eye, picture that magazine on that table?
Yes.
Still,
Yes.
huh? And which cover was it? Do you recall?
It's not a photograph; it's a caricature.
Oh, like a painting?
Yeah, and I think it's Man of the Year.
Oh, okay. And I'm not challenging you. I'm just like
No,
trying to
I
put
did
you in the
have
moment.
I did have to look all these things up, and it was as I described it.
Well, there are so many of them. It's easy to, like have your brain pick the one, and it's easy to get it wrong. So I appreciate you indulging that. But like when you sit there in that room and you see it, like there it is, and it becomes something later on. I wanted to go back to your folks for a few minutes because
Sure.
we lose track of time and what life was. So we're talking here late 50s, early 60s, that era. But your folks come from a completely different planet almost, because they're Europeans, and what they had to do to come up, to grow up, to survive. And you talk about some of the stories that your dad would tell, and they would be so impossibly hard, his upcoming, that you would think, did he make these up even? And so talk a little bit about the nature of your parents, and then their love, they're immigrants. And so their love for America, their love for people like the Kennedys or the Eisenhowers or whoever it is, because you have a very idyllic 50s upbringing, according to your, that part of the book when you talk about how you grow up.
Yeah, in fact, in writing the book, I purposely wanted to sort of set the stage, which was Fort Worth, Texas in 1963 or 62. A very, very conservative community, a very patriotic community. But my father lived two lives. One was a successful petroleum engineer who played golf with Ben Hogan at the Rivercrest Country Club. And my
Right.
father remarkably had no accent, which is very difficult because he left Russia in 1921, or
Mm.
yeah, 1921. And he was a 18-year-old kid. And usually that means you're stuck with an accent for life. He had no accent. So most of the business people he worked with had no idea he was from Russia. And then we were part of this Russian community, Russian immigrant community, which was comprised of Civil War immigrants like my father, George Bucha. And the more numerous part was the displaced person community.
Mm.
And they were like 90%. My father, George Bucha, and Golly Clark were first generation. And if you were a displaced person who had made it out of the Soviet Union, and probably you were Ukrainian or Estonian or whatever, this was the typical member of this Dallas Russian community. And in terms of patriotism, they were super patriots. You know, one could not say anything negative about a president, about the country, about the flag, whatever. That would have caused a real eruption. So that was really the community in which we moved. And this community was led by George Bucha, and for some reason, I could not picture George Bucha, although he and I'd been together, on numerous occasions. So I was desperate to find a photograph of him, and did not succeed, even though he endowed a chair at Southern Methodist University. So finally, I found a picture of George Bucha with my parents, which is in the book, and I think that's the only extant photograph of George Bucha, which it's a little oddity aside, but I don't know how many weeks I spent trying to find a picture of George Bucha.
Mm.
And it is exactly as you would expect: lean, angular. You could see him in the court of Nicholas II as a functionary, which is what his father was.
I'm glad we took that time out to talk about that, because that takes us over into the Russian community, and you talk extensively about how the Russian community looked after the people that made their way into at least that part of Texas, and how once they discover Marina and they detect the problems with the relationship and the way that things are going, they do their best to a point to kind of save her, right? And that doesn't work out. There's all these points where if only this had
Yeah.
happened,
Mhm.
maybe something would change. But would it, or would it have, or would Lee have always, like, if Lee had just calmed down? Maybe he's ADD. Who knows? Like ADHD or whatever. But could they have had a solid life? Could he have aged out of this whole thing by just getting a little bit more mature and settling in, and then just getting a government job, and then 4 years later, just being a manager and just being too busy with a couple of young kids to get crazy?
Well, I'll repeat what I said earlier and then add on to it. His biggest turning point, his biggest mistake was leaving Minsk, because that's where
Right.
he would not have had a better life than Minsk anywhere in this world. Lee was a grass is greener on the other side of the fence guy.
Yeah.
And if you look at, I did make a calculation that the time he and Marina spent in Fort Worth, and that was the time I was with them the most, was the longest amount of time he stayed anywhere except Minsk. So he was nomadic, sort of a vagabond, and hauling Marina behind him. I've often thought about this turning point question. Did history change at this moment? But that can drive you crazy because the probability of the two of us talking as we are right now is about 1 in 100 trillion. So that's the way you need to look at life.
Right.
I do believe the dinner at our house, which Lee tried to avoid for reasons he understood quite well, because this would put him and Marina in company of people who are going to speak Russian, and Marina spoke maybe 2 words of English, and that's going to reveal to her, who he really is. And indeed, when Anna Meller started harassing him almost, and she was a very mild, soft-spoken woman, but she really got on his case. And remarkably, I can remember the seating. We had a big dining room table, and I was at the right corner. Lee was next to me. Then I think Marina was next to him, so I could see him, and you could see him sort of pushing back in his chair, his voice rising, and Anna attacking him. Why did you do this? We all know Soviet Union is hell, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, but there's unemployment in the U.S., but there are poor people and there are rich people, and he's extremely defensive, and so this is Marina seeing him in a totally new light. And the worst thing for Lee, once the dinner party ended, was George Bucha volunteered to drive them home, which was only like 10 minutes from our house. And that meant George Bucha knew where they lived, started appearing with gifts and baby carriages and so on and so forth. So Lee's, I would say that's a real turning point. And I kind of think of it as a handoff from me to them, because I was really the only person they associated with at that time. But after the Dallas dinner, then the Dallas Russians started creeping into his life, much to his chagrin.
Yeah, it's crazy. Do you recall, because again, you're just having dinner, and I'm assuming this is a dinner with friends. Like there's no like, oh boy, this is going to be a dinner. But did you have any sense that it would be anything other than that? And then when Anna is interrogating and going after Lee, do you recall that being uncomfortable? You're like, oh boy, this is getting
Yes.
ugly. Like, what is this dinner like? And in real life,
it was very uncomfortable. And at that point, George Bucha said, it's been a very nice evening. It's time to go. So he wanted to defuse the situation. And in fact, he had planned the dinner in such a fashion that as to avoid such confrontations, because if you think it over, how he would have looked at it, look, this guy must have a real problem because of the background and so forth. So I'm going to organize the evening such that I'm going to spend time with Marina. We're going to look at maps of Petersburg or Leningrad as she knew it. And Lee was just sort of hanging around. No one wanted to talk to him. So he was just, and Lee always dressed well. That was one of the characteristics of Lee, that he always tried to dress well. He tried to avoid looking like a manual worker. So he was well dressed. I can almost picture, I think it was tan, the sports coat. So he was sort of hanging around, doesn't know what to do with himself. So he's in another room. He's in what we call the den. I went in, we just sort of sat there not talking. And then, dinner served, and then the confrontation with Anna, and then George said, time to go.
It's wild to think that I mean, I don't know how many people are left alive from that dinner, but you and Marina still exist. Have you ever did you try to reach out for the book? Have you ever, since the time when you turn and you look and that's the last time you ever see her, obviously you can't go see Lee anymore, but have you ever thought to look her up and just to chat and to let you know
Yeah.
there's healing in that, maybe? I don't know.
Well, I thought about it, and I talked to her husband, who's a
Mm,
very fine guy. Seems like they live isolated in some rural community outside of Dallas. Um, he's the one who answers the phone. There may be occasion where she might answer, but I spoke to him, I guess, twice, and he just didn't want people from Marina's past to associate with him and with her. He's very, very set on this. So that was my effort right there. And I figured,
mm,
if they don't want it, I don't want it. And then there would have been the problem of if we really got into a discussion like this of conflicting memories.
right.
Because remember, for me, this was one of the high points of my life, or low points, let's say.
Yeah.
For her, just think of the life she's had.
Yeah.
I'm a very minor figure in that life, and so I would have a lot to say. She'd have very little to say, and she might even have forgotten that there was a dinner party. Who knows? Because
Yeah.
there's
Right.
this symmetry of experiences. But
Yeah.
it would have been very interesting. The publisher did communicate with her, unbeknownst to me. I probably would have advised them not to. And she actually wrote back, this is behind me. I don't really want to get involved in this, which I very much understand.
Yeah. I mean, it does her no foreseeable good, right? If she's coped with it and if she's lied to herself to cope with it, who cares, right? Like she's the one that had to bear this stupid cross all these years because of the actions of her husband, and he left her with that. And I'm assuming no interaction with any of the kids or anything. You haven't maintained any of that,
No, I mean, I June, the older,
right?
was a baby, and my memory of their living conditions was her sleeping in an open suitcase that they'd rigged as a bed. So
Right.
that's my memory of her, and she was remarkably quiet. So she was at the dinner party on my parents' master bed, and she slept the whole time. So I just remember her as a very quiet, well-behaved baby. So there's, and I doubt if she has a lot of interest in meeting with me.
Right.
So
Right.
that that describes the lack of relationship with Marina or the kids.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
kids seem to have turned out just fine.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. We only have a little bit of time left, and there's so many interesting things in the book, and I don't want to get distracted by the conspiracies because that's not really the heart of what makes your book interesting. So the first thing I'm going to say is everybody should buy the book, and if you're at all interested by the Kennedy stuff, this is the book to get because there's so many new things, and to include Paul's recollections and the story. The book is a super easy read, and you know what I always say, buddy read. So buy a copy for you and a friend and read it together, and that way you're helping out Paul, who's, and really honestly, like, this book was just, it's very interesting. And it's fun to come up with these elaborate schemes, but when push and shove come together, one finger, one trigger, it makes a lot more sense. And when you get to know the man like Paul did, you start to go, well, there's definitely some problems there. So what when you went through, what was more interesting to you, the recollections and your experiences and the rediscovery of how the government saw you, or was it some of the other stuff that you were able to pull out of the archives that are now released and unclassified?
To tell the truth, I learned relatively little from, let's say, the Warren Report, which is a voluminous monster, but done excellently as far as I can see. They really did a good job with it. And so I kind of react when I hear criticism of the Warren Report, because I can not conceive of it being done better. But with respect to things that I witnessed or I knew of, I really didn't find any big lapses in memory. So, and that's one of the most important things that I was after in doing research. I was quite fascinated by the KGB file of Oswald, because I've been working with such files and could pretty much, I'd be one of the ideal persons to authenticate this as well. And it was authentic. And it does, as I say, the file it consists of two parts. One part is Lee is a youngster in Minsk, in Moscow. And the second part is the assassination. And in both cases, and as I said, I was surprised that his case as this rather odd teenage tourist in Moscow, that his case was dealt with by the Politburo. Very few things get to the Politburo. So that, although, my first inclination is the guy shows up, he's dealt with by tourists, and they decide he should leave. I thought it was sort of a local issue, but it turns out, there was serious discussion at the Politburo level. So I would say that was the thing that interested me the most, but it could be because of my professional interests coincided with this.
Mm-hmm. And do you think because there was a Cuban Missile Crisis and that was such a dangerous time, do you think that his presence caused more attention at all? I mean, that we had Calder Walton on the show the other day. He's a historian from Harvard, and he wrote a book called Spies, and it looks in the East and the West. And when he looks at all of the pieces and puts it all together, because everybody's playing their individual part, he's like, man, we came so close. We got lucky. The timing worked out the way it did.
The Cuban Missile Crisis had a great impact on me. I doubt if it had much of an impact on Lee, because those of us who lived through it, I was a college student. Right. I remember wondering, am I going to wake up the next day? And indeed, it came that close. So it was a very significant event for me, but it had very little to do with the assassination. I would say the most important thing to note about the assassination theories is it seems to rest on this Mexico City trip. Mm-hmm. And I think the conspiracy theorists do not understand what Lee was up to. He was up to a life in Cuba with Marina, and in order to get that life in Cuba, he needed to get both a Soviet visa and a Cuban visa. And it turns out, if you look at the details, it's very difficult to do this. And so that's the reason he was in Mexico City. He was there to get a visa. If the visa had come through, they would have gone. There had been no assassination. So a lot has been made of the fact that the consular official with whom he telephoned, which was intercepted, and that's a side comment on classification, because surely everybody knew that the U.S. Intelligence community was eavesdropping on telephone calls to the and so, but they kept that in the top secret files forever and ever, just to confirm what everybody already knew. So I'm a critic of overclassification.
Yeah, me too. I was a counter.
But I think it's because it does seem to boil down to that trip to Mexico City, and it's either conscious or unconscious misapplication of what he was up to. He, as I said, he's grass is greener on the other side of the fence. Right. U.S. didn't work. Russia didn't work. Cuba's going to work. I'm going to have a perfect life there. That was him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I guess let me ask this question, try it a different way. I'm less worried about the Cuban Missile Crisis impacting him directly, but did how Russia treat him, and maybe the timing doesn't work out, but
No,
was he there? Like, was there, because they want an asset, they want people to deal with, but also is he just like, oh, this guy's a problem, let's get him out of here? Is how is their treatment different to him, or was he already on his way back when the crisis happened?
what was that? October '62.
October 62, yeah.
He came in June of
Oh, so
'62.
he's already back. Okay, okay.
Yeah, and he's a welder.
Right.
Who knows whether he even read the news? I don't know, but I would really have nothing to add about that.
Okay, yeah, no, no. I just didn't, the timing thing, I wasn't sure like if that had impacted their treatment of him. Um, yeah, what an odd case. You talk about this letter that you get, and I think this is another fascinating thing. And I don't know how much you think if I would have paid more attention or if I would have written a different response. But talk a little bit about this letter that you get when you're at school and how you respond and the what impact you think it might have had.
I consider that letter extremely important. Um, I can't get anyone else to consider it as important as I think it was,
Right.
because it was really uh, an unveiling of the true Lee to Marina. And it happened in this way. I go back to Norman, Oklahoma for school. Lee and Marina, courtesy of the Dallas Russians, moved to Dallas. So I think around November 20th or so, right before Thanksgiving of '62, I get a postcard. It says, "Dear Paul, we've moved to Dallas. Here's our address. I have a good job and a nice apartment. Come visit." So I read it, and there are grammatical errors. And at the time, I was not aware that Lee had these learning disabilities. And so I figured with all these misspellings, it must be Marina trying to learn English. And so I wrote a long letter to her, because I thought she wrote the postcard, that it's T-O, not T-O-O, and you're supposed to use punctuation, because Lee never used punctuation. And on Thanksgiving Day, get a phone call. I'm in Fort Worth. They're in Fort Worth visiting Robert for Thanksgiving dinner. Now come, I'd like you to come get us and take us to the bus station. But those weren't her first words. Her first words were, "Lee wrote the letter, not I." You know, and you can imagine how, and they kept every letter they ever got, because all of his correspondence is in the Warren report. That letter is not there. So the minute he got it, he must have burned it. But by that time, the damage had been done. So I go and pick him up at Robert's house, going to take him to the bus station. And we had a very, very restrained, sober 2 hours in our house. And Marina, by this time, Marina was quite open about mistreatment. So she was telling all these bad things about Lee, and Lee was sitting there, his shoulders slumped, sort of as if each word were a body blow to
Yeah.
him. So that letter, for sure, she held that over him. I'm sure he was. It would not be possible to read that letter, for her to read that letter without her understanding that Lee was sort of a fraud, because Lee had told her they were going to live off his royalties from his historic diary.
Right.
So anyway, that
Yeah.
letter was very important.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it. I mean, is there a world where he saves that marriage, or does he think that it's time for action? And I've already faked my suicide once. I got to get bigger, and obviously, he shoots at the general, so he's ramping up his importance in terms of history and where he's going. But is there any way that he ever? Because he has to beg, borrow, and plead just to get her to go to Thanksgiving, right?
Correct. I think it was a true marriage of love. It's a very strange love story because once they moved to Dallas, she had all kinds of friends, Russian speaking friends, with whom she could seek refuge. One being Ruth Payne, who was studying Russian, where she was quite welcome and
Right.
enjoyed living. So, but the fact that she could exit the marriage if she wanted through her friends gave her all kinds of opportunities to cut it off. But each time she would let him know where she was. She would give the telephone number where she was, et cetera, et cetera. So, and yeah, my father was with her when he had to inform her that Lee was dead. And she insisted on going to Parkland to see the body. And once they were in the morgue, she performed sort of a Russian type ritual, with the body. So I think it was a very strange love story, to tell the truth.
We
But
have a couple minutes.
who
Yeah.
am I to judge such things as a 21-year-old kid?
Yeah. 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 Especially, yeah, when you're, yeah, who knows? Can we really briefly cover Marguerite's bayonet, that chapter, because that's also fascinating.
If you got to know Marguerite, you would know Lee. You would know Lee, because they were identical. And I think it is very interesting that Lee hated his mother so much. And I think the reason he hated her so much is that she was he and he was she. You know, she felt that life had mistreated her, that every job she had, there was someone who was against her. She was destined for greatness, but it was they kept her from being great. She was always wanting to sue people, and so on. She was incredibly irritating. Um, so she and Marina, my father, two Secret Service agents, hold out in Six Flags Inn with the kids and Marina and Marguerite, the mother. And my father spent the whole day there. He would leave late in the evening and return in the morning. They stayed at the Six Flags Inn. And Marguerite's behavior got more and more bizarre as time passed. And almost immediately, I think that was after Lee was shot and dead. She said, well, I demand he be buried in Arlington National Cemetery because he's actually a secret agent for the government. So he died in the line of duty. Then she would, once they were at Six Flags Inn, she would go to the center of the room and say, I have an announcement to make. And so she would make some kind of odd announcement. So she was crazy beforehand, or the event drove her crazy. But she immediately started thinking about money, because envelopes started coming in with money for Marina, but not for her. So she was extremely angry and jealous of Marina, that Marina was getting the money, she was not. And it got to the point where it was sort of an untenable situation with her, Marina, the girl, and the kids all together.
Right.
And Marina and Marguerite slept in the same room. And for some reason, Marina went through her Marguerite's belongings and found a bayonet. They confronted Marguerite the next morning, and she said, "Well, women must have means of defending themselves." So that was her. I don't know if she always carried around a bayonet, but it sort of shows who she was.
Yeah.
and then by the way, they then segregated Marguerite from Marina and the kids, because she could have posed a real danger with the bayonet. And then they both went back. Marina went to Dallas to live in the home of, that's a long story, someone. They took her back to Fort Worth, where she decided that the Secret Service agents were out to kill her. So when she went to testify before the Warren Commission, she called the local newspaper for a reporter to go with them to prevent the secret agent from assassinating her on the way. So she was totally bonkers. And she bothered our family for, I think, about a year. Telephone calls.
Just real briefly, this moment obviously changed anybody from your generation, your time. It changed your guys' lives. You happen to look on TV and go, holy, I know that dude. I mean, that obviously changes your life. He says these words, I'm a patsy.
Yeah.
And that creates like this, what? And then he's dead. If he survives, is this worse for you? Or is it better that he dies? Have you ever thought about that? Like if he survives and
I thought when I saw Ruby, and I saw it on live TV, Ruby shooting Oswald.
Yeah.
I said, we're not going to ever know the truth.
Yeah.
And that was my reaction. I don't know if others reacted in that way or not, but clearly Lee was looking forward to this trial. You know, he according to Marina's testimony, when she saw him for the last time in the jail, he was a frightened kid. But you know, this was his life's work, and he had pulled it off. And he was going to testify and talk about Marx and surplus value and the proletariat, et cetera, et cetera. So, this was his life's achievement. And this, what I thought a lot about was the killing of Trippett, because Trippett was a ordinary guy, earned a living, had kids, and so that really spoiled Lee's narrative. That so he clearly Lee panicked because what he did was not very smart. Getting off the bus, going home, getting the pistol, getting in a cab. Probably the first time he was ever in a cab, because he walked or used the bus. So, but going back to your question, my thought was we're not going to know the truth, and this is going to be a big mess. And so in that sense, I was quite prophetic.
But was your burden lessened by that?
No.
Okay.
I think it was clear this is going to go.
Yeah.
We would not get the answers easily that we really needed to get, because Ruby is the problem. You have to figure out two weird guys doing weird things, and then you have to explain his behavior, Lee's behavior, et cetera. So I said it's going to be a mess.
Yeah. And not only will we never know the truth, we'll never believe the truth now. There is no truth anymore.
Well, the one thing I got out of writing this was that I started thinking it over, and it was our loss of national innocence, because as far as I was concerned, the Warren Commission was blue ribbon panel, the top people in the U.S., all with very excellent reputations. And the fact that the American public would not accept their judgment meant a loss of innocence. Since then, whenever there is a commission report, it's always met with skepticism. Somebody's lying, it's based on lies, etc. And I think a notable national event was the public rejection of the Warren report.
Yeah. Well, listen, I've had you for just a little bit over an hour, but I appreciate it. It's been great. The book is
Felt like 15,
fantastic.
felt like 15 minutes.
That's what I want, man. That's what I want. It's great.
And
And
I hope we can talk again about something that you and I both know a little bit about.
yeah, and it's been incredible. I really any closing thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, I'd say no, I'm glad I wrote the book.
Yeah, me too.
The fifth reason for delaying is it's the loss of privacy. It's made me something of a public figure where I don't want to be a public figure. If it were Nobel Prize, I'd be very happy. But knowing Oswald is not that big an achievement. So a loss of privacy, I would say.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Everybody really should go check it out. If the Kennedy assassination is at all interesting to you, you have to have this book in your collection. It's really fantastic. Stand by for 1 second, Paul. I'll be right back to you, and I'll say goodbye proper.
Okay.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank